There's a quiet assumption built into the way the world was designed that certain kinds of thinking, deep thinking, expert thinking, the kind that actually changes what's possible for a person, that kind of thinking was always going to be rare. Rare because it takes years to develop. Rare because it lives inside a small number of people who charge by the hour, who are booked weeks out, whose offices are in cities you might not live near. For most of human history, access to expert knowledge was rationed. Rationed by geography, by money, by status, by something as arbitrary as whether you happen to know the right person. If you had a legal question, you needed a lawyer. A medical question, a doctor. A complex strategic question, someone who billed in increments of 15 minutes and didn't always explain things clearly anyway. The expertise existed. It was just behind a door most people never got to open. And the strange part is, we just accepted it. We built entire social systems around the assumption that deep knowledge would always be scarce. Who got good advice shaped who made good decisions. Who made good decisions shaped who got ahead. And slowly, quietly, that scarcity became invisible, just the way things were. Something is beginning to change that. Slowly, imperfectly, with complications worth sitting with, but the direction feels unmistakable. High-quality reasoning about complicated problems is becoming dramatically more accessible. A first-generation college student can now get the kind of patient, thoughtful academic guidance that used to require expensive tutoring or a lucky connection to the right mentor. A small business owner can work through legal and financial questions that used to mean paying someone hundreds of dollars just to understand the landscape. A curious person, anywhere, with almost any kind of question, can explore ideas at a depth that used to require a great university library, years of study, and frankly, a certain kind of permission that not everyone was given. What happens to the world, to creativity? There's a word that doesn't get used enough when we talk about knowledge: permission. Think about what it actually took, not long ago, and in many places still today, to get serious guidance on something serious. It wasn't just money, though money was a big part of it. It was knowing that you were the kind of person who was supposed to ask. There's a texture to that, a subtle one, that's easy to miss if you grew up on the inside of it. The assumption that a lawyer's office was a place you could walk into, that a doctor would take your concerns seriously, that a financial advisor would return your call. Those assumptions weren't universal. They were inherited, passed down through generations of access, of familiarity, of knowing how the rooms worked before you ever entered them. The gatekeeping was rarely announced. It didn't need to be. It lived in the price of a consultation, in the jargon that assumed you already knew the jargon, in the referral systems that only activated if someone already in the network vouched for you, in the quiet, compounding disadvantage of not knowing what you didn't know and having no one around who could tell you. And here's the part worth sitting with. The people building those systems weren't necessarily malicious. Most of them were just operating inside the logic of scarcity. If there are only so many hours in an expert's day, some mechanism has to decide who gets them. Price is one mechanism. Reputation networks are another. Credentials, connections, geography, all mechanisms. Each one neutral sounding, each one in practice filtering along the same familiar lines. What's strange is how thoroughly that logic became invisible. It stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like physics, like gravity. Like, of course, this is how knowledge works. You earn access to it, or you're born near it, or you go without. Generations of people made major life decisions, medical, legal, financial, creative, with incomplete information. Not because the information didn't exist, but because the layer of permission between them and it was never designed with them in mind. That layer is still there in many places, but it's thinning. And the thinning is uneven. Some people are already living in a world where a sophisticated question gets a sophisticated answer within seconds, while others are still navigating the same old maze. That gap matters. The transition isn't clean, and it would be dishonest to describe it as one. But something has shifted in the architecture. The permission layer, the invisible infrastructure that decided whose questions deserved real answers, was never a law of nature. It was a design, a set of accumulated decisions dressed up as inevitability. And the most interesting thing about a design is that it can be redesigned. We talk about the scarcity of expertise like it was always just a fact, like the knowledge itself was the rare thing. But pull on that thread a little and it starts to unravel in an interesting way, because the knowledge was rarely as scarce as the access to it. A great legal mind in one city couldn't help someone 3 states away, not practically, not affordably. A doctor's insight was bound by geography, by appointment windows, by the physical limits of one person's time. The expertise existed. What was scarce was the delivery mechanism. That's a very different problem than it sounds. Scarcity of knowledge and scarcity of access aren't the same thing. But for most of human history, the distinction didn't matter much because there was no way to separate them. The expert and the expertise were inseparable. You needed the person in the room. So institutions built themselves around that constraint. Whole professional architectures rose up: licensing systems, referral networks, billing structures, years-long credentialing processes. All of them shaped, at least in part, by the assumption that knowledge lived inside individual people and couldn't be easily moved. And that assumption was reasonable. For a very long time, it was just true. What's strange to sit with now is how thoroughly that constraint got baked into the culture. Not just the systems, but the feeling. The feeling that complexity belongs to specialists. That if something is difficult to understand, the right move is to defer. That your job as a regular person navigating a medical question or legal tangle or a financial decision is mostly to trust and mostly to wait. There's something almost archaeological about looking at it now, like finding the fossil of an old constraint and realizing the wall it created is still standing even though the original reason for the wall dissolved a while back. The information was never the problem. There's more recorded human knowledge accessible today than any single person could engage with in 1,000 lifetimes. The libraries got enormous. The internet made them nominally free. But enormity isn't the same as usability. A library you can't navigate is just an overwhelming room. Data you can't interpret is just noise. What was always missing wasn't the raw material, it was the synthesis. Someone or something that could take complexity and make it legible, that can meet you where you are, engage with your specific situation, and help you think it through. That's the piece that was actually scarce. And it turns out that piece wasn't scarce because knowledge is inherently rare. It was scarce because synthesizing knowledge, translating it, applying it to a specific human context in real time, that used to require a human being. A particular kind of trained human being with limited hours and a waiting list. The myth wasn't that knowledge was hard to find. The myth was that those limits were permanent. It doesn't announce itself. That's the first thing worth saying. There's no ceremony around it, no ribbon cutting, no moment where someone officially declares that the rules have changed. It just shows up quietly, in a kitchen at midnight, in a small office above a hardware store, in a college dorm room where someone is the first in their family to ever sleep in one. A question gets asked, a real one, the kind that used to require an appointment, a referral, a fee. And something answers, carefully, specifically, without impatience, without making the person feel like they should already know this. I keep thinking about what that moment actually means, not abstractly, concretely. A first-generation college student who has never had a tutor, never had a parent who could walk them through academic writing, never had easy access to the kind of feedback that shapes how you think, suddenly has something patient enough to work through a draft with them at 2 in the morning. Something that doesn't get tired, doesn't make them feel behind. That's not a small thing. Or a small business owner, maybe someone who builds something real with their hands and their instincts, now trying to navigate a contract they don't fully understand. Or a tax question with implications they can't quite see. Or a hiring decision that feels legally murky. The old path was find a lawyer, find the money to pay one, hope the advice was worth it. The new path is quieter than that, less formal, more immediate. Still imperfect, that needs to be said clearly, but present, available. What shifts when that kind of access becomes ordinary is something harder to measure than efficiency. It's something closer to dignity, the experience of being taken seriously, of having your specific situation engaged with rather than generalized away, of walking into a decision feeling like you actually understand what you're deciding. For a long time, that experience was unevenly distributed. Some people grew up with it, surrounded by adults who modeled how to navigate complexity, who had the right contacts, who could make a call and get a real answer. Others grew up learning that complexity was something to be managed around, that certain questions were above their pay grade, that the smart move was to defer to whoever seemed more official. That gap doesn't close overnight. And it would be naive to suggest that access to better thinking tools automatically translates into equity. There are layers of this advantage that run deeper than information. But something real is shifting in the texture of everyday life for people who were always capable of asking sophisticated questions and just never had anything sophisticated enough to ask them to. The equalizer doesn't make noise. It just shows up where it's needed and quietly changes what feels possible. There's a version of this story that's purely optimistic. And that version is real. The access is real. The shift is real. The people whose lives are genuinely different because of it are real. But optimism that doesn't account for the complications has a way of becoming its own kind of blind spot. So it seems worth sitting with the harder questions for a moment. The first one is about confidence. One of the subtle dangers in having access to sophisticated sounding guidance is that it can be difficult to know when the guidance is wrong. A human expert, a good one, carries their uncertainty visibly. They hedge, they refer you out, they say, "I'm not sure about that, let me check." The signals of limitation are built into the interaction. That texture is hard to read in a different kind of conversation. When something responds fluently, organized and calm, the fluency can feel like authority, and fluency isn't authority. Knowing the difference, knowing when to trust, when to verify, when to find a second opinion, that's a skill, and it's one that doesn't come automatically just because the access does. The second complication is subtler. There's something that happens when you outsource the thinking, rather than use the tool to extend your own. It's the difference between having a conversation that sharpens your understanding and having a conversation that just produces an answer. Both are available. The second is faster. The second also leaves you roughly as capable as you were before you asked. Over time, across thousands of small decisions like that, there's a question worth asking about what happens to the muscle, to the habit of sitting with a hard problem, turning it over, tolerating the discomfort of not immediately knowing, and finding something on the other side of that discomfort that you couldn't have found any other way. None of this is an argument against the access. It's an argument for being intentional about how you use it. Tools shape the people who use them, always have. The printing press didn't just distribute ideas, it changed how people related to memory and oral tradition. Search engines didn't just make information easier to find, they changed how people hold information in their heads. This is the same kind of moment, and the shaping is already happening whether we're paying attention to it or not. There's also a third thing. The gap between who has fluent access and who is still navigating without it isn't closing uniformly. In some ways, the tools are narrowing old inequalities. In other ways, they risk creating new ones, between people who know how to use them well and people who don't, between institutions that adapt and ones that calcify, between questions that the tools handle gracefully and questions that get subtly mangled in translation. The story of expanded access is genuinely worth telling, and the complications are part of the story, not a footnote to it. Holding both at once might be the most honest place to think from.
There's a certain kind of loss that never gets counted, not because it isn't real, but because it leaves no record. The problems that were never attempted, the questions that were never asked, the ideas that arrived in someone's mind, stayed there for a while and then quietly dissolved, not for lack of intelligence, not for lack of drive, but for lack of the one thing that might have helped them take a next step. We tend to measure progress by what gets built, what gets published, launched, solved, shipped, the visible outputs. But there's a whole shadow history running alongside that one. Everything that almost happened. Every person who had the seed of something real and no soil to plant it in. Think about what it actually takes to pursue a complicated idea. At some point, you hit a wall, a legal question you can't answer, a financial structure you can't decode, a technical domain just outside your reach. For most people, most of the time, that wall was also a stopping point. You could push against it for a while, but without someone on the other side who could help you through it, someone with the right knowledge, the right time, the right willingness, a lot of ideas just stalled there. And the ideas that stalled weren't randomly distributed. They clustered in zip codes without resources, in communities without networks, in individuals who had every reason to believe their idea was worth pursuing, but no mechanism to find out for sure. The person who might have caught something early, if only they'd had access to the right medical knowledge at the right moment. The small business that never scaled past survival mode because the strategic thinking it needed was priced out of reach. The young researcher in a place without institutional support, sitting on an insight with nowhere to take it. These aren't hypotheticals, they're the ordinary life for most people on Earth across most of recorded history. The loss is staggering if you let yourself actually look at it, not with guilt, but with honest curiosity about what it means that we might be now living at the beginning of something different. Because the questions that went unasked weren't unimportant, they were just unresourced. And there's a real difference between a question the world didn't need answered and a question the world never got the chance to hear. Something shifts when the threshold for attempting a hard thing gets lower, when the wall that used to stop people becomes something they can think alongside instead of give up in front of. The ideas that emerge from that shift, we can't predict their shape yet. We're still in the early hours of a very long morning. But somewhere, right now, someone is asking a question they would have swallowed 10 years ago. And something is actually answering. There's a difference between getting an answer and developing one. It's subtle at first. Both feel like progress. Both might produce the same output on a given day. But over time, across dozens of conversations, hundreds of small decisions, the difference between the two starts to compound in ways that actually matter. Think about what happens when you work through a hard problem with someone who's genuinely engaged with it. Not someone who hands you the solution, but someone who asks a question that shifts your angle slightly, who reflects something back that you said 5 minutes ago and connects it to something you hadn't connected yet, who sits in the confusion with you long enough that the confusion starts to organize itself. That experience, the experience of thinking alongside rather than just receiving, is one of the things that actually changes how mind works. It's how good mentors operate, good teachers, good collaborators. The goal was never just the answer. The goal was the sharpening. And here's what's interesting about where things are now. That kind of engagement, the back and forth, the patient questioning, the willingness to stay with a problem at whatever hour you happen to be thinking about it, that used to require another person, a specific kind of person, one who had time and expertise and genuine interest in your particular line of thinking. Rare, expensive, often inaccessible. What's available now can approximate some of that. Not perfectly. There are things a human thinking partner carries that can't be replicated, and it would be dishonest to flatten that distinction. But the approximation is real enough to matter. Real enough that someone working through a genuinely difficult question, a strategic one, a creative one, a philosophical one, can now have a conversation that actually moves the thinking forward rather than just retrieving information. The key word there is conversation, because the quality of what comes back has everything to do with the quality of what goes in. Half-formed questions get half-formed responses. Specific, honest, genuinely curious questions. It's something closer to a real exchange, which means using these tools well is itself a kind of skill. The skill of knowing how to think out loud, how to push back on a response, how to ask the follow-up that actually matters. There's something almost old-fashioned about that skill when you name it that way. It's basically the skill of dialogue, of Socratic exchange, of the kind of conversation that philosophy departments used to claim as their territory, and that most people rarely had access to outside of a classroom. Maybe what's quietly expanding isn't just access to answers.
Maybe it's access to a certain quality of thinking process, one that used to require the right room, the right institution, the right relationship. The room is getting larger. And who gets to think seriously, rigorously, expansively with something genuinely pushing back is starting to look different than it did before.
For a long time, the institutions held everything together. And that's not a cynical observation, it's just accurate. For a long time, universities weren't just places to learn. They were the containers that made learning transferable, that verified it, credentialed it, gave it a shape that the world could recognize and respond to. Law firms, hospitals, consultancies, all of them solving a version of the same problem. How do you take something as diffuse and complex as human expertise and make it reliable enough to build a society around? You institutionalize it. You create structures that concentrate knowledge, vet the people who carry it, and distribute it in controlled, legible ways. That was a genuinely good solution to a genuinely hard problem. It produced remarkable things: modern medicine, legal systems that function, financial infrastructure that at least theoretically serves collective interests. The institutions earned their authority, not always and not without real failures, but substantially over a very long time. What's happening now isn't that the institutions were wrong. It's that the problem they were built to solve is changing shape. The scarcity they organize themselves around, the scarcity of synthesized, accessible, personalized knowledge, that scarcity is loosening. Not gone, not evenly distributed, but structurally different than it was even a decade ago. And institutions built around a particular constraint tend to struggle when that constraint shifts. Not because the people inside them aren't capable, but because the architecture itself encodes the old assumption. The assumption that knowledge needs a container, that access should be structured, credentialed, metered. Some of that still matters enormously. The credential that tells you a surgeon actually knows what they're doing, that's not a bureaucratic inconvenience. That's a load-bearing wall. The peer review process that catches bad science before it spreads, still worth having. The legal accountability that comes with professional licensing, still real. But around the edges, in the vast gray territory of questions that don't require a licensed professional, but used to require one anyway, simply because there was no other option, something is quietly reorganizing. People are navigating more on their own, asking differently, arriving at professional interactions better prepared, more specific, harder to simply defer. What that does to institutions over time is generally unclear. Some will adapt, find ways to add value that the new landscape can't replicate, deepen the things that actually require human judgment and accountability and presence. Others may calcify, defend the container long after the contents have found another way to move. The crack in the wall isn't the end of the building, but it does mean the building has to decide what it's actually for, separate from the monopoly on access that used to answer that question automatically. That's not a comfortable reckoning for any institution to sit with, but it might be a necessary one. We started with a question. What happens to the world, to creativity, to power, to human potential when the bottleneck on intelligence starts to dissolve? 8 segments later, the honest answer is still we don't fully know. And that might be the most important thing to hold on to. We've looked at the permission layer, the invisible architecture that decided whose questions deserved real answers, built not out of malice, but out of the logic of scarcity. We've looked at the myth underneath that scarcity, the way limitation got mistaken for inevitability, and how the real shortage was never knowledge itself, but the capacity to synthesize it for a specific human moment. We've seen what the ship looks like up close, in the kitchen at midnight, in a small office, in the hands of someone attempting something they would have abandoned before. And we've sat with the complications honestly, the way fluency can masquerade as authority, the way easy answers can quietly atrophy the muscle that hard questions build. The way access expanding unevenly can create new divides even as it closes old ones. We've mourned a little. The shadow history of unasked questions, of ideas that stalled at a wall that didn't have to be permanent. We've noticed what changes when thinking becomes a conversation rather than a transaction. And we've watched the containers that organized knowledge for centuries begin to reckon with a world where the problem they were built to solve has changed shape. All of that adds up to something. Not a conclusion, something more like a threshold. The feeling of standing at the edge of a transition that is genuinely underway, genuinely unfinished, and genuinely open in ways that earlier moments in history were not. Because the thing about dissolved bottlenecks is that they don't determine what flows through. They just change what's possible. And what's possible is always shaped by the people inside the moment, by what they choose to attempt, what questions they decide are worth asking, what they build with the access once they have it. There's a version of this transition that goes somewhere remarkable, where the people who are always capable but never resourced finally get to find out what they can do, where the problems that went unsolved because the solvers never had the tools start getting attempted, where the quality of human thinking broadly, not just among the privileged few, quietly rises over a generation. There's also a version that's more complicated than that, where the tools get used without wisdom, where access expands without equity, where institutions fail to adapt and leave people worse off in the reorganization. Both versions are live possibilities. The direction isn't written yet. Which brings it back to something personal. Because these aren't just civilizational questions, they're also ordinary ones. The bottleneck that's dissolving isn't only between populations or institutions. It's between you and the questions you've been carrying, the ideas you've been circling, the thing you've been meaning to think through but never quite had the right conditions to pursue. So here's what I keep wondering, and maybe you've been sitting with a version of this too. What is the question you stopped asking because you didn't think you've got a real answer? And what might happen if you tried asking it now?